The Witch's Promise by Page Turner 627. I never believed in curses, not until my last day in Papua New Guinea. The market of Port Moresby was bustling, a vibrant tapestry of colors and sounds, and amidst it all was an old woman with a table full of strange amulets. Her eyes locked onto mine as I passed. "Protect yourself," she croaked, her hands trembling as she held out a gnarled dark talisman. I laughed, more out of discomfort than amusement. "No thanks," I said, brushing past her. I was there for photographs, not superstitions. Her voice followed me, raspy and chilling. "You will wish you had it," she warned. That night at the hotel, the weirdness began. My waiter walked straight past me 3 times before I practically shouted for his attention. He blinked rapidly when he finally noticed me, as if seeing me for the first time. Annoyed, I chalked it up to a long day. The next morning was worse. I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror fading, like mist over a river. I blinked hard, shook my head, and looked again. Clear as day, there I was. I must be losing it, I thought. But then, at the airport, a ticket agent looked right through me when I tried to check in. I waved my hands, I called out. Nothing. It was like I was air. I glanced down at my hands. Translucent. My heart pounded, and panic clawed up my throat. The witch's words echoed in my mind, a taunting whisper in the growing chaos around me. Desperate, I caught a cab back to the market. The witch was there, her eyes finding mine instantly, a smug, eerie smile creeping across her face. "Please," I begged, my voice thin, probably as faint as my body. "I'll buy the amulet. Please, just stop this." Her smile never wavered. "Too late for amulets," she hissed. "You ignored the spirit's first offering. Now, you belong to them." I stared at her, horror-struck, as people passed around me, oblivious. I was fading, my very existence slipping away. "What do they want?" I managed to choke out. Her smile widened, chilling me to the bone. "They are lonely, always so lonely. They need company. Every ignored warning sends another to join them." I felt a coldness wrapping around my very soul, pulling me away. I turned, frantic, and caught my reflection in a nearby window. There was nothing. No one there. Just the bustling market and the living going about their lives. As the world dimmed, the last thing I heard was the witch's cackle, a sound that would haunt the nothingness I was becoming. In my final moment of clarity, I understood the cruel irony. I had become invisible in death, as I had been in life, unnoticed, fading away, just as I had made her feel at our first meeting. As I vanish into oblivion, I write this post in hopes that my tale warns others. Beware. Respect the unseen, or join the forgotten. Beware the Solstice by the Prowler. As the days grow longer, warmed by the summer sun, a hush falls over the village, for the summer solstice has begun. Farmers' labors are replaced by fear, for they know the witch is near. Mindful of their children, they look to the sky to keep a shepherd's eye on what they hold dear. A time for festivals and traditions are dampened by the foreboding conditions, for the witch is here, looking for another, an innocent child she claims from under the covers. She only takes one, unless it's her favorite, a sister and brother. The village is cursed, the elders will say, for what their ancestors did one dark solstice day. In need of the sun to help grow their crop, they took the witch's mother and tied her to the stalks. In the pagan traditions they burned her that day and prayed for the sun to take their burdens away. The young witch who watched from the shadows cursed the village that day. When the solstice begins, that's why she takes the children away. In her wake, she leaves ruined families that she has done in. Now, the children must suffer for their ancestors' sins.
Thank you, Stacy, for inviting me to the summer solstice ceremony. Even though I'm a little nervous, as it's my first Wiccan ritual, I do thank you for teaching me and bringing me here. This open field in a forest preserve is very lovely. The beautiful little bonfire is lit and feels so good.
The Esbet is called Letha, and you are most welcome, Janet. There isn't anything to be nervous about. It's a ceremony to praise the heat and light of the sun. It's a ceremony of life. We stand in the circle to feel the warmth of the bonfire. It's symbolism of the sun. Again, no need to be nervous.
I know, it's just that I'm a newbie, and I feel like I'm not welcome. Everyone here in the circle is looking at me strangely.
That's because you dressed, well, a little so-called witchy. Now be quiet and enjoy the bonfire. The priestess and priest are starting the ritual.
Tonight, the fire will rise as the sun is at its peak. Feel the heat, my fellow practitioners.
Hey, Janet, something is different about this tonight. This ritual feels different, unusual.
What do you mean?
The priest. He isn't the normal priest who's been doing the rituals the last few years. He seems a little weird. I don't know, but something is strange about him. I'm actually feeling something more than I usually do. Something weird.
I feel some strange energy as well, like real hot. Is that normal?
Well, it is a bonfire, but yes, the energy from the bonfire seems to be growing, getting hotter. I'm also feeling tingling sensation in my lower legs.
Let the circle feel the power of the bonfire tonight on this night of Letha. Let the wheel burn tonight. Let the worshippers feel the sun and fire.
Oh my God, Janet. Do you see that? The bonfire is increasing in size. How can that be? It's reaching higher in the sky. Janet, I can't move. I feel stuck to the earth.
Is that supposed to happen?
No, it's not. I am not feeling good about this. This is getting weird. It sure isn't feeling right. It feels evil. I'm not liking this at all.
Oh my God! Sandy and John just caught fire. They are fully engulfed in flames. I can't take the screaming. Someone please help them. Someone please help them. I can't move.
Shit. The priest is somehow making the bonfire leap to the coven members. He's burning us in a circle. We're gonna die.
Let the priestess be sacrificed and the god will be in its peak of his power. I will be in the peak of my power. I will be the one. Once the fire wheel is complete, I will have the ultimate power.
Oh, my goddess.
What? What's happening? I can't see around the fire to see the priest. The fire is too big now.
The priest just picked up the priestess and threw her in the bonfire. It must be so hot. She died instantly. The fire is growing. It's getting out of control.
Oh, the fire circle is getting closer. Jane and Adam are on fire now. The screaming is awful. The fire circle is making its way towards us now. It's getting closer. What can we do?
I'm trying to get loose from the ground. The magic he has on us is strong. I can't get loose.
Hurry. This shit from the priest is real. Real magic.
I know. Somehow, some way, he has some real power. There, I got loose. Take my hand, Janet. I'll pull you loose.
Okay, I'm free. Let's go.
Run, and don't look back. All the Covenants are on fire. Shit, he's starting to follow us.
No one will leave the circle tonight. I will have my power once the fire circle is complete.
Wait, Janet, come back.
He won't get away with this. I'll get him for this.
That was the last night I spent with a coven. No more bonfires for me. I just hope the priest doesn't come after me to try to finish the ritual. Poor Janet. Blackberries by Serious Sarcasm. As a young boy, my friend was the girl who lived in the trailer across the street. We were both the youngest out of 4, and our birthdays were a day apart. Living deep in the woods of Illinois, in a small community that turned a blind eye to abuse, we would always go play in the woods. Often I recall her face, stained from passion, while we gathered blackberries from along the abandoned railroad tracks that ran through the forest. One winter, the creek flooded the entire woods and then froze over. After a few days, the ice became thick enough to support us, so we put a couple blankets, food, and drinks in a sled to skate through trees. After a few hours, I walked away from her to relieve myself. Standing near a tree on the ice that I knew was on the bank of the creek, I felt the ice crack. I plunged into the freezing water and would have been swept away if not for the branch I was holding to keep from sliding while pissing. When I looked up, she was already standing over me, grasping the tree with her arm outstretched. She took off my clothes, wrapped me in the blankets we brought, and then rubbed my limbs to warm them. She dragged me in that sled for nearly 4 miles across the ice, just laughing the whole way. That was our 11th winter. Late into the following July, we were walking down our favorite trail, where the most blackberries grow. The sun had already set, and the moon was full. Our parents would not miss us, since it was poker night. She was wearing my favorite white cotton summer dress, and I was beginning to notice how pretty my friend was. Well, she always acted more like a boy than I did, so when I grabbed her hand and awkwardly stared into her green eyes, muttering about this and that, she stopped me. Walking ahead of me, while looking at the sky, she told me a story her grandpa told her. 100 years ago, a witch built a house deep in the woods. One summer, 3 girls went missing, so the townspeople gathered and burned the witch in her house. As the building was burning down, the witch let out one last cry. "So long as your children live on these lands, I will haunt and seek their souls." Her grandpa said that whenever a person stood between the 4 posts that were left standing under a full moon, the witch would come for them. I begged her not to go. I told her I had a bad feeling. I wanted to go to our favorite glade and try to steal a kiss. She said I was just scared. And I must admit, I was. She stepped up to me and taking my hand asked, "So, what do you want to do tonight?" Of course I was scared. I did not even have the courage to say what I really wanted to do. We followed the path to those damn squared posts. She took both my hands and walked backwards between them. As she stepped into the middle, we broke into a beam of moonlight. She stretched onto her toes, gently kissed me, and said, "See, there's nothing to worry about, as long as we are both here." As we kissed ever more passionately, I could taste the bitter sweetness of blackberries on her. The ecstasy made my vision turn red. The next morning I woke up in my bed, worried it was just a dream. As soon as I took a shower, I ran to her house. Her mother was crying, and her father began questioning me, saying she never came home the night before. He knew I had been with her and was ready to kill me. I told him everything I remembered, and we rode his ATV out there quicker than hell. The coroner said she was attacked by a bobcat because it was the only way to explain the teeth and claw marks. I had already admitted to the sin we shared before I read it out. I moved away a month later. There was no way I could ever stay there, but she has never left me. Every night, when I am walking alone, I feel a warm hand wrap around mine and hear her sweet voice whisper into my ear, "So, what do you want to do tonight?" The Witch in the Woods by the Prowler. My grandfather always sat us around the fireplace and told us about his childhood and the small New England village he grew up in. He would always regale us of his adventures with he and his friends throughout the village and the surrounding woods. But there was one story that we haven't forgotten to this day, and never will. Now this particular tale, my grandfather and his friends were playing in the deep woods surrounding their village. My grandfather said he began to notice that they were getting to a part of the woods they've never been before, but didn't get too concerned because him and his friends were having such a great time, and the woods were just so beautiful. It was fall, you see, and he said the colors of the leaves were simply mesmerizing. The bright reds, yellows, and oranges popped from every tree branch. The deeper he and his friends got, it seemed they were more and more entranced by the beautiful colors. The air was cool and crisp. There was a sweet aroma wafting from the distance, almost encircling them. Faster and faster they went, jumping and laughing. Around and around they played, moving and shouting, spinning and spinning. Just then they stopped, and when they did, they just stood there in awe. In the distance, there stood a cabin, long and dark, with a big black tree that stood over the cabin next to the far window of the dilapidated cottage. It looked eerie, especially surrounded by the other trees in the forest. It had no leaves, and it was dark as a cold winter's night. The children stood there looking at the cabin with their jaws dropped. They didn't even know anyone lived out this far into the woods. Their parents never mentioned it, and no one in town ever talked about a person living in the woods. As my grandfather and his friends began to discuss what they were looking at, The front door of the cabin swung open. Out walked a slender older woman with long black hair with silver streaks throughout, holding a basket of breads and pastries. That was the sweet smell the boys had smelled earlier. My grandfather said she looked eerie. Something about her seemed off. He couldn't put his finger on it, but there was something spooky about the old woman. As he stared at her, she looked up and noticed the boys looking at her. She smiled an evil smile. Then she spoke to them. "Hello, boys. What are you doing over there? Why don't you come in? I have many tasty goodies inside. Cupcakes, pastries, candies, even ice cream." My grandfather and his friends looked at each other in amazement. They've never seen so many foods all at once. They walked toward the front of the cabin as she smiled at each one as they entered. My grandfather stopped in his tracks. It felt like he was being dragged into that cabin by the smells of the food, and every time she opened her mouth, it felt like he was being dragged closer and closer to the front door. Just then he saw a rock, picked it up, and hurled it towards her head, hitting her right between the eyes. Her concentration was interrupted, and he turned and ran away, running non-stop all the way into town, telling anyone who would listen what had happened. Most of the men in the village and the families of the friends followed him back to the dark old cabin in the woods. But to my grandfather's dismay, the old cabin wasn't there. Just the old black oak tree that stood over it, and next to it on the ground sat a basket of delicious treats. Needless to say, my grandfather's friends were never heard from again, and my grandfather and his family were forced to leave the village. So if you ever come across a dark cabin in the woods under a black oak tree, and you start smelling delicious treats in the air, stop, turn around, and if anyone is with you, make sure they stay right by your side, because you've just encountered a witch, and she's hungry for you. Grandpa's Encounter with a Texas Witch by SkylaFotia. My grandfather grew up in Jacksonville, Texas, back in the 1950s, and if you haven't been there, you wouldn't be missing much. He grew up as the oldest of 5 brothers and sisters on a farm with his ma and pa. He passed away about a year ago, but I wanted to share a story he told me while I came home from college for break. Naturally, Papa didn't come from much. His parents' generation suffered through the Great Depression, and farmers didn't fare off too well. But being the gritty Texas farm folk that they were, they thrived in it. Having a farm and a big pasture surrounded by the pine trees made for a good childhood, as he told me. He would reminisce the times of gathering the whole town's kids to play baseball games to pass the hot summer days. Though as his health deteriorated, he began to talk more deeply with me, and actually talked to me a lot about life lessons, and one thing in particular, fear. He asked me if I'd ever heard of witches. I said of course, but he stops me, and as serious as he could, he asked again. No, not the Halloween characters, but actual witches? I told him that I did. I could tell it made him uncomfortable talking about it, 'cause it really screwed him up as a kid. He explained to me that he had encountered one 3 times growing up. The first time he saw her was when he was 10 years old. He and his siblings were playing around sundown outside in the pasture when he said it happened. About 200 yards away from him, where the tree line of the forest began, was where he could see a dark, floating silhouette. He said that he couldn't focus because of the lack of light, but he swore to me that the figure's head was crocked at a perfect 90-degree angle, looking right at him. He said it was inhuman, and remembers rushing the little ones in and telling his parents. They didn't let the kids out after sundown, ever. The second encounter was when he was 12 years old. He and a friend who was their closest neighbor would walk on a trail through the forest to school every day. He said it was about a 2.5-mile walk, but one day as they were walking home, they saw a bum covered in quilts walking on the left side of the trail. Being very confused by why somebody who they didn't know, who was completely submerged in dirty quilts, would be on this trail in the woods. They eerily stared at the person as it passed them. He said that he smelled something like a mix of rotten and sour. As the person passed them, Grandpa said that he had become very dizzy and incoherent to what he was doing. He pointed out to me that he felt drunk, and that the neighbor boy felt the same way. A few moments later, he hears a snarly giggle behind them, and it's the person covered in dirty quilts. Still being completely hidden by the quilts, it began running after them. He said he didn't stop running until he had busted down the front door of the farmhouse. The neighbor's boy didn't ever come back to his house. The incident was widely spread around town, and quickly became a warning to all those who would go into the forest. He told me he had never found out what happened to the poor kid. The third time, and the last time he saw the witch, was when he was a senior in high school. Grandpa was going to be a Division I football player for the University of Oklahoma, and quite frankly was a hometown hero. He said that he had just met my grandmother and really wanted to enjoy the rest of his senior year before he left to the Sooners. So he attended a prom after party in the woods with his classmates. Being that his class had only 60 people, everyone was out there. He admitted that he got pretty lit and wanted to fool around with Grandma. Ooh. He went to take a leak a couple of yards away from the bonfire and heard shuffling noises. As he tried to focus, he said he saw a hut. A small stream of smoke was emitting from its chimney and smelled like the stench he recognized from when he was 12. He told me never had he gotten sober that quickly. As he proceeded to investigate this hut deep in the forest, a dark figure emerged from the shadows. He tried to focus on its face. He told me he could never quite get a good look at it. All of a sudden, the figure started to whisper. As it intensified, he felt a burn on his arm. He said it felt just like when his fraternity brothers branded his body with their fraternity letters. After what the hell just happened, the figure slowly floated and submerged itself back into the darkness of the forest. He became frantic and realized that everyone was about 100 yards away from him. He said there was no way that he wandered off that far and started screaming for help. He admittedly told me that he wet his pants, and I couldn't help but chuckle a little. The creepiest part about this story is that the police investigated the hut that my grandpa had found in the forest. It was a effing gore fest. A lot of dead animals and birds were found, as well as human remains. There's no evidence it was the neighbor's boy, but he said everyone knew it was. My grandpa was a fantastic person and the most kind, loving man I knew. I knew he couldn't have made this up, because he still has a burn mark on his arm, to where he felt the witch burn him on his prom night. The Witch by hthrflwrs. I came to the witch on a hot summer night. I was a young man, and my father had grown ill, so I took the trek out to the heart of the forest to seek her wisdom. When I arrived at her door, it was past the witching hour. I was battered and bruised from the whipping of the midnight trees. The witch looked me up and down, said, "You're late," and ushered me inside. Her cottage was on leg-like stilts, an unsettling design that made it look as though it were sprinting while standing still. Were it to take up motion and whisk me into the night, I would be helpless, but I had no other choice but to enter. My father's life was at stake. The inside was dark, musty, and full of all manner of horrible herbs and materials for spell work and devilry. "My father is very ill," I told her, taking a seat in a low overstuffed chair. "How so?" she inquired, carefully putting down a mug in front of me. I made sure not to drink it. You cannot trust a witch. The village priest told me so. "He is encompassed by anger during the night. In the daytime, he is apologetic, but he never quite remembers why. He breaks things, screams at me for not being a proper son. He is the very image of wrath, and then he forgets. I fear it is the devil's work." "You came to a witch to break the devil's work? Are you daft?" The priest refused to help him. He only saw my father as upstanding and denied that he could be any other way. The witch took a long drink from her mug. She stared me deep in the eye for an uncomfortably long time. There was an intensity I was unused to in her gaze. It almost felt like recognition. Finally, she responded, "I will make it so no one will face his wrath again. In return, I only ask that you come back to me again once you are ready." "Ready for what?" "To begin again." We found my father's body the following morning. It seemed he had gone to the Lord peacefully in his sleep. We buried him as the season shifted from summer to autumn. I was the only person who remained tearless throughout the ceremony. I suppose I had said goodbye to him long ago. In the dead of winter, I went out to the witch again. She greeted me with open arms, like an old friend. 3 summers have passed since then. With each turning of the seasons, I learned more from her. She's shown me the most delightful concoctions to turn my hair gray and my eyes piercing, just like hers. We are the witches. We are the gardeners of the world, tearing out the strangling weeds so the flowers may grow. We have freed so many wrathful spirits from this world. Won't you come and stay? The Witch Tree by Lord Nuke. I currently live in a big city. However, until a few years ago, I used to live in a much more rural area. I used to joke and say that I lived in the middle of the woods, but that wasn't far from the truth. My family, being a farming family, had a lot of land and had a few large plots in different areas. One such plot of land, closer to town, was where my grandparents on my father's side lived. There was a tree near one of the fields, commonly a strawberry field, occasionally cabbage, depending on crop rotation, that always struck me as odd, even as a child. It's a fairly tall pine tree, with decently thick green on the top. But the base and middle are what were odd. It was burned right through the core, all the way to the top. As a child, I could look up it and see daylight through the top. But as time went on, the top grew over to block it. My father told me that when my grandfather was younger, he tried to burn down that tree. The tree survived, and since then my grandfather has been insistent that the tree not be cut down or destroyed. No further attempts have been made. My father and many of my uncles, big family on that side, had taken to calling it the witch tree, and would tell us tales of a witch that lived in the hollowed-out core. Of course, as kids, we were skeptical. It seemed that everything scary or supernatural to our parents' generation could be chalked up to witches. They would tell us stories of how, when they were kids, they would camp out near the base of the tree at night, look up at midnight, and something would come out of the tree and chase them off. This sounded like a challenge to me. I couldn't get my brother to go along with it, so I packed up my camping gear, one-man tent, sleeping bag, basic supplies, etc., and departed. I let my parents know I was going camping in the woods. Being as I'm fairly woodsy, and it wasn't hunting season, they had no objections to this at all. An hour and a half of hiking later, I was there, ready to pitch my tent and prepare for the night. It was a fairly uneventful afternoon and evening. I set up camp, gathered wood, and set up a pit for fire. Foraging for berries. Wild raspberries were in season, and they were still remnants on the strawberry field nearby, and tried unsuccessfully at fishing in a nearby stream. It was in the middle of summer, and darkness came late, so it was close to 9 when I lit my campfire, and then I waited. I kept a medium fire, feeding it larger pieces of wood occasionally, and roasting a few marshmallows on a stick. Midnight grew near, so I approached the tree. Pocket knife in one hand, flashlight in the other. I wedged myself into the hollow of the tree, looked up, and waited. I frequently checked my watch, and the time seemed to drag like an eternity. Soon, the air started to change. I'm still not sure how to describe it, but imagine the change in the air as late summer becomes fall, as a few early frosts come and go. Imagine the changes in smell, in air temperature, in overall feel. Imagine that distilled into a few minutes instead of a few months. A strong, almost paralyzing fear came over me, and as I shakily brandish my knife, aim my flashlight, and force myself to look up, nothing. I was suddenly standing at the bottom of my driveway, an hour and a half hike away from where I was camping. My tent was dragging from my back, my sleeping bag tucked under my arm, my supplies laying on the ground beside me. I have no memory of walking there in the middle of the night. I checked my watch, and it was stopped at 11:58. My flashlight bulb was broken, and my pocket knife was missing. I suddenly realized my right hand hurt. I looked, and there were deep marks in my hand, as if I had been gripping my knife as hard as I possibly could. Freaked out by this, I raced up the driveway and slipped into the house as quietly as I could. Strange occurrences had nothing on my father if you woke him in the middle of the night. I didn't sleep that night. I took the time to unpack, check, and neatly repack my tent. It had been hastily balled up, so I wanted to pack it properly and check inside for my missing knife. I checked my bags and couldn't find said knife. The next day I decided to go back to the tree. I couldn't remember why I was afraid, or why I left, or even how I got home, but I somehow knew it would be fine in broad daylight. I arrived at my campsite early afternoon, and some things struck me as odd. My campfire, for one. It wasn't really a campfire, so much as a pile of sticks, unburned, and some larger chunks. It was like there had never been a fire at all. The cooking sticks were nearby, with marshmallow remnants, and the empty marshmallow bag was tucked under them. It was like I had sat and fed an invisible fire, cooking marshmallows and eating them, with no flame. Even the cup of shavings I had used for kindling was untouched. I searched for my pocket knife, as it was important to me. My father had given it to me as a Christmas gift the year before. I finally found it, laying on the ground, in the base of the tree. It was mangled nearly beyond recognition. The handle was damaged, as if it had been crushed in a vise. The blade was broken at the middle, and the remaining half was dented nearby. Terribly. I dug around and found the other half, which was also dented, and covered in a black goo that smelled of pine sap. My father found the remains of my campsite the next day, and casually mentioned it. I didn't bring up the knife, because I was worried he'd be upset. I told him I had packed up midway through the night, and went home because it was too cold. He looked at me knowingly, said, "And now you know," and never mentioned it again. I bought a new knife and threw the remains of the old one away, so he would never find out what happened to it. A few years before this incident, my grandfather had passed away in his sleep. At the time, some of my father's siblings had made comments about how the tree outlived him. It struck me as ironic that a tree he tried to burn down as a child outlived him. What was stranger was at the reading of his will. A section came up stating, "The tree is to never be removed, burned, cut down, or in any way damaged." I recall my father and his siblings all accepting that as a perfectly normal and reasonable request. More recently, probably 5 or 6 years ago, I was talking to my uncle when the topic of the tree came up, and memories of this camping trip came back. I asked him if he and his siblings ever had a second campout under the tree. He told me that there would have been no point to it, as it was a lousy camping spot. I then asked him if there was anything that he knew of that would cause a person to think that they had made a fire, but leave no trace of flame the next day. He looked at me with that same knowing look my father had given me, then shook his head and told me, "Nothing good can come from asking troublesome questions." He quickly changed topics after that, and resisted any attempts I made to steer the conversation back to the tree. In the years since, I've never been able to bring myself to make a return camping trip myself. I live in the city now, and don't visit home often. But even when I do, even when the weather is good, I can't bring myself to try. I'm incredibly curious, especially about the gap in my memory. But I have a strong feeling that going back would be a bad idea. The Witching Tree by the Priestess of Spiders. Everyone knows about the witching tree. Everyone knows that it is different. It is tall and gnarled, and has long, spindly branches that reach up to the sky like the rigor mortis legs of a crushed spider. Nobody recalls ever seeing leaves on those branches, but the witching tree doesn't feel dead. It doesn't look like any other tree around it, on the hill at the park. It's not an oak, nor a pine, and certainly not one of those big redwoods that you've seen in the foothills. The witching tree is the witching tree. You know you're supposed to capitalize it when you write it out, just like God. You have a feeling that it would know if you didn't. As long as there have been children, as long as there have been knives, there have been those who took it upon themselves to leave their mark on the natural wood, carving their sign into the bark of a living thing to prove that they were there, that they were real. All of the rest of the trees in the park have at least a couple such scars from the vanity of children, a prepubescent drive for immortality. The witching tree has only one. Nobody said you couldn't carve your initials into the witching tree. There wasn't a list of rules that you had to follow. Children just know these things. Most of them, anyway. Tommy Colgate didn't care about doing what he was supposed to. He'd say curse words in front of teachers, he'd pull girls' pigtails, and he'd throw rocks at pigeons. He also had been given a shiny new whittling knife for his birthday. All the other children watched when Tommy climbed up the hill, the sunlight glinting off his knife as he unfolded it. They all watched as he plunged it into the bark, carving out a jagged, clumsy T.C. He seemed so smug when he came back down the hill, smiling like he'd just won the lottery. He was the first kid to carve his name on the witching tree. He would also be the last. The other children weren't surprised when Tommy didn't come to school the next day. They weren't surprised when they saw his obituary in the local newspaper, the one which conspicuously left out the cause of death. Those who went to the funeral weren't surprised that it was a closed casket. Nobody carved their initials into the witching tree and got away with it. Sometimes you can still hear some of the older kids whisper tales about Tommy Colgate, about the countless slashes that covered all over his body, arranged in odd patterns like some sort of alien language, and the rust-brown stains they found on the witching tree's branches. They'll laugh it off, of course, say it's just a ghost story. But to this day, there is still only one set of initials carved into the witching tree's bark. I would like to give a heartfelt thank you to the special friends of the channel for your overwhelming generosity. If you would like to support the channel, the link is below in the description. Also, please send me your stories and poems to duchessofdarkness27@gmail.com. You can also find me on Instagram at duchess.ofdarkness and Twitter at duchessofdarkn2. I want to thank all my listeners for your kindness, your encouragement, and your support. It means the world to me. Thank you for joining me. Until next time.